I'd like to welcome you to the launch of this issue of Work in the Global Economy on the theme of Labour Process Theory, 50 years after Braverman's Labour and Monopoly Capital. My name is Jenkins, and I'm very loosely chairing this webinar on behalf of the new team of co-editors for the journal. I'm here on behalf of my colleagues, Martin Chavinsky and Georgios Gouzoulis. And this is another very brief opportunity for us to thank Kirsty Newsom and Sian Moore and all the colleagues that have been working on the journal over the past 3 years for everything they've done to set the journal on an excellent path. And today, I think it's quite a red letter day for the journal, because this is a truly excellent contribution to our understanding of theory and practice. And we're going to hear from 5 of the papers in this, I think, important issue. So we're going to hear from Paul Thompson, we're going to hear from Sarah Nies, then Zhang, James Steinhoff, and finally Stephen Vallas. Again, as thanks are in order, we're very grateful to Bristol University Press for this opportunity to showcase this issue. So just to explain the mechanics of what we're going to be doing, once we begin hearing from the authors of the contributions to this issue, each speaker will have around 7 minutes to give us a flavour of their paper. And in the interest of time, each speaker will introduce the next one in line. I will interrupt at 5 minutes just to give a 2-minute warning to the speakers. So apologies if I interrupt people's flow. But that's in the interest of us having about 20 minutes at the end of the presentations for debate. So as we move through the papers, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And we will try and pull these questions together during the session so that we can address questions to the panel on your behalf at the end. It's probably unlikely we'll get through all your questions, but we'll do our best to have a really enjoyable and healthy discussion. And without further ado, because I don't want to take up any more time away from the speakers, I'm going to hand over to Paul Thompson, who's going to kick things off for us. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Jean. The fact that we're gathered online 50 years after the publication of the seminal and initiating text of labour process theory is a testament to its capacity for resilience and renewal. And in this paper that I co-wrote with Chris Smith, we try and focus on what underpins that capacity for resilience and renewal, arguing in essence that labour process theory, as it matured, developed a toolbox which offers use value to new generations of labour scholars to enable conceptual innovation and empirical expansion into new areas of work. We use an analogy with the notion of normal science to emphasize how labour process theory operates as a research community with common norms and research questions, and how it flourishes in part because it has a distinctive sphere of competence, which we take to be workplace regimes in the context of capitalist political economy. Now, I want to emphasize here that this is an empirical object rather than the conceptual resources which are brought to bear on it. And a good example of this is in the paper from Stephen Vallas and Juliet Score, in which they bring issues of class and experience of class into discussion of platform labor in order to explain variations in the preferences and behaviors of platform workers. So that this empirical object of inquiry is still within the labor process, but the conceptual resources are broader from it. I also want to emphasize that the theory building project that we call labor process theory is an open and pluralistic endeavor. We don't all think the same things, as the papers show. What we do, I think, using the notion of normal science, is talk about the same things in broadly similar ways, and share a commitment to resolving differences by appeals to evidence rather than doctrine. Now, some of the tensions with other constructs in labor studies, such as labor control regimes, are, I think, flow from this distinctive competence, in that those other constructs bring in different scales and different disciplinary orientations, which means that we're often not talking always about the same things, but we do occupy a shared space in which dialogue and development can take place. Returning to the idea of the toolbox, we argue that labor process theory has a two-level conceptual architecture. The first consists of ordering and identifying principles which identify the characteristics of the capitalist labor process and order the way that we approach them, starting with issues of value extraction and then working through to control, resistance, and so on. These principles were really a synthesis of what came out of first and second wave labor process theory, and are obviously Marxian in origin. The second level is operational categories, which are all the assorted categories about accumulation, about skill, about control, and so on. So this would include, for example, de-skilling, which we treat as a second order category. The first order category would be cheapening the costs of labor power, which derive from the logic of accumulation. And this is different from the paper argued, the paper put forward by James Steinhoff.
2 minutes, Paul.
Okay. So we spend a lot of time in the paper looking at how that toolbox is being operationalized through various research programs. What I'd like to emphasize is that when we hit the new century, changes in capitalist political economy and the emergence of fragmented but interconnected workplace regimes meant that labor process research had to expand its scope and make connections in different ways through its combinations with global value chain or production network concepts, for example. And it continues to face challenges. And we argue in the latter part of the paper that the greatest challenge it faces, drawing particularly on the work of my co-author, Chris Smith, is in understanding more diverse sources of labor supply and labor flow, particularly where workplace regimes are impacted by informal labor, by migration, even by unpaid labor, for example. And that this is not just an empirical question, but requires us to expand some of the core or modifies some of the core concepts of labour process theory, particularly indeterminacy of labour. Chris has already developed the concept of the double indeterminacy of labour power, which has facilitated a lot of really important work on mobility power, for example. But as we argue at the end of the paper, there are other ways of expanding the notion of indeterminacy, particularly around the emergent area of the ecological transformation of the labour process. And in our view, the intellectual history of this theory building project gives us confidence that we can face these challenges with some confidence. Thank you.
Perfect timing, Paul.
A miracle. Oh yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'll now hand over to Sarah Nies.
Thank you, Paul. Braverman has inspired generations of researchers to study workplace regimes based on the control imperative, whereas his equation of capitalist domination with a Taylorist mode of control has been contested from early on. Until this day, there's still a tendency to assume that de-skilling and standardization remain the somewhat preferred managerial strategy if applicable. In our paper, we challenged that perception, discussing what we call the inner marketization of the firm and a corresponding mode of control. We believe this sheds light on different and contradictory managerial interests beyond the transformation of labor power alone. In particular, we want to point out that the increasing trouble to reconcile the inherent logic of the production process with volatile market dynamics as a fundamental managerial problem of the labor process. We use the term inner marketization to describe a market-centered mode of production where market pressures are brought more directly to bear through financialized targets, perpetual corporate reconstruction, and the utilization of market mechanisms within the firm. The corresponding mode of control, which we call indirect control, rests on managerial strategies of responsibilization. Instead of a detailed prescription of tasks and the close surveillance of work activities, it rests on a more direct confrontation of workers with market-oriented targets and the transfer of entrepreneurial responsibility on the workers, yet under framework conditions set by management. Nevertheless, modes of control that appear less restrictive are often mistaken as some kind of concession of the employer. But besides the fact that indirect control proves to be quite effective in securing the transformation of labor power and cannot be understood as a release of managerial domination, it serves further managerial interests that a Taylorist mode of control cannot anymore. In short, it can be interpreted as a strategy to manage what we call the reconciliation problem. This is twofold. Every production process aims at valorization, but also contains an inherent logic that must be oriented towards the substantive production, as use value remains the carrier of value. At the same time, valorization only takes place when value generated in the production process can be actualized in the circulation sphere. Reconciliation then occurs as a problem because the actualization of value is neither secured by creating use values nor by the extraction of value within the production process or the transformation of labor power alone, yet both remain indispensable. But the labor process must also be organized in anticipation of the actualization of values in the circulation sphere. The process of production has to be aligned with market dynamics. This has always been the case, but in times of the correspondence of standardized production and mass consumption, it did not appear as a particular problem of the labor process. It was solved through market strategies at the boundaries of the organization. In times of increased global competition, flexibilization, and predominance of buyers' markets instead, reconciliation between the economics of production and the economics of the market, as Alfredson Rethel calls it, now occurs as a fundamental problem. And indirect control from our perspective can be interpreted as a strategy to deal with this increasingly apparent contradiction between the both, in the way that the problem to translate market requirements and profit targets into concrete tasks of the production process is, at least in parts, now imposed on employees or workers themselves to solve. For that reason, we remain skeptical regarding the spread of digital Taylorism as an overall tendency, even if digital technologies offer new possibilities for control. But we would argue that the way technology is deployed is not only inspired by the control imperative, but also by the requirements of reconciliation with contradictory effects on utilizing and restricting workers' autonomy. In our own empirical studies on digitalization, we observe both close monitoring and the standardization of procedures and work tasks that leave little autonomy on how single work steps are done, but at the same time, the enhancement of responsibility for the overarching and interlocked workflows. But even where similarities to Taylorist methods can be observed, they are now entangled with a different mode of legitimation that does not release workers from entrepreneurial accountability. And this is our second argument, which I cannot elaborate on in detail, but we like to emphasize that every workplace regime, even the most coercive ones, rests on a foundation of legitimation, which is usually contested, but nevertheless. And the Taylorist mode of control was based on the principle of legitimation, principle of merit defined by calculation of human effort. This principle would today constantly be violated in workplace regimes where externally defined outcomes sets the bar. Thank you. The legitimation of the regime of inner marketization instead is based on supposed factual necessities, the inescapability of market forces. Management actually avoids calculating work effort upfront because work effort is expected to adapt to predetermined outcomes in a flexible manner. To sum it up, our main argument is not that indirect control is predominant everywhere, but the analysis of indirect control sheds light on the fact that workplace regimes tackle different and contradictory managerial problems. So we suggest for a deeper understanding of any workplace regime, we need to consider the problem of reconciliation and legitimation alongside the problem of the transformation of labor power. For sure, you could probably include these questions in a broader understanding of the term or problem of transformation of labor power. You could argue that transformation of labor power should be the transformation into profitable labor. But I think the analytical distinction of the reconciliation problem can help to tackle more precisely managerial strategies in their respective accumulation context. Labor process theory has already been criticized in the past for not considering the full circuit of capital, but I just want to point out that our argument is a little bit different here. So we do not want to contest the focus on the labor process, but rather suggest to analyze how changing conditions of the realization of value reflect on the labor process itself. And with this, I hand over to Zhang Lu, who will talk about the changing nature of work and employment in China.
Thank you, Sarah. First, I want to thank the journal Work in the Global Economy for organizing this webinar. I'm delighted to be on this panel. In my paper, I focus on how labor process theory has been engaged and utilized in analyzing the rapid and profound changes in work and employment in China, as the country transitioned from a planned economy under state socialism to a capital-oriented market economy integrated into the global economy. While industrialized countries in the West have experienced deindustrialization and the decline of industrial sociology, China, the world's largest manufacturing country today, has witnessed rapid industrialization and the formation of the world's largest working class over the last 4 decades. In this historical context, the labor process theory has provided an important theoretical framework for scholars to understand the empirical reality of the changing nature of work and employment in China. Some of its key concepts, such as labor power, control and consent, exploitation, and degradation of work, have been widely utilized in the study of Chinese workplace by labor scholars, both inside and outside China. Chinese scholars found Michael Boroway's notion of factory regime particularly useful, with its emphasis on political apparatus of production and its attention to the state, meant it was well positioned for understanding economies in transition and the rule of state practices. The labor process theory's capacity to connect the workplace to broader political economy has allowed it to continue to expand its scope of analysis and engage with new developments and emerging issues in the Chinese workplace, such as the rise of digital platform labor, informal and precarious work, and workplace regimes in the global value chains. At the same time, my analysis shows that the engagement is a two-way dynamic. China labor scholars have also made notable contributions to the labor process theory by adapting it to the Chinese context and theorizing the Chinese experience. Through a workplace-based approach, China labor scholars have theorized the role of the Chinese central and local states in shaping various factory regimes, expanded on Chinese workers' diverse subjectivities in research on labor process, and developed new concepts such as dormitory labor regime that connects productive and social reproductive spheres. My review also shows that there is no single or dominant labor process in China, and understanding the diversity and the complexity of the Chinese workplace in different industries, ownerships, and regions is essential to capturing the rapid changing nature of work and employment in China today. Certainly, there is a limitation of the labor process theory in understanding and explaining labor issues in China. For example, in areas of labor legislation, trade union reforms, labor NGOs, and social welfare reforms. As I have stated in the paper, on the one hand, we should pay close attention to what challenges the China experience has posed to labor process theory, and which of those challenges have theoretical potential and are likely to contribute to the development of labor process theory. On the other hand, given China's unique conditions, we should also be aware of the limitations of the Chinese experience in the global knowledge production. Moving forward, several areas can be particularly productive for further engagement of labor process theory in labor research in China. First, China's massive waves of internal migration have had profound impacts on the Chinese economy and society. The importance of labor mobility, what Chris Smith calls workers' mobility power, has been emphasized in more recent work that has used China as a key empirical testing ground. We should continue to pay attention to the new trends in labor mobility and internal migration, especially in the context of China's industrial restructuring and capital relocation, to understand the changing work and working class in China.
2 minutes.
Second, thank you. The relationship between technology and work continues to evolve. With rapid technological advancement, such as automation, AI, and digital platforms. Understanding how technological change restructures work tasks, skill requirements, control and consent in the labor process, and its effects on job security and worker autonomy requires innovative empirical research and theory building. In addition, with the rise of new work arrangements such as home, remote working, research examining issues at the intersection of productive and social reproductive spheres is much needed. Third, we should pay greater attention to workers' subjectivity and agency in research on precarious work and informal labor. As existing studies have shown, the way workers experience informal and precarious work is not the same and should not be generalized. Also, our analysis should not be limited to the point of production, as workers' subjectivity is influenced by other factors beyond the workplace, such as workers' social demographics, class positions, expectations, social networks, and labor market conditions. Moreover, precarious and informal workers have agency and the potential to fight back, despite their limited access to workplace organizing and workplace power. To conclude, as Thompson and Smith have highlighted in their paper for this special issue, by adjusting some of the core concepts and boundaries to consider development, such as new sources of labor power and mobility, without losing the empirical focus on workplace regimes, labor process theory as a normal science can continue to help further our understanding of the current and future trends of work, employment, and the broader political economy in China and beyond. Thank you. With that, I'm handing to James Steinhoff.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thanks for being here. My paper in this collection is trying to do two things. Trying to return to Braverman to show that the classic text is classic for a reason, even in the context of a completely different sector of work, like high-tech, high-skill data science work is what I study. But it's also to argue that we do have to update the classic concepts and push them forward to make them adequate to the changed empirical or material conditions, technical conditions specifically. And the suggestion of the article, I wouldn't say it's the argument of the article, but it is a suggestion, is that de-skilling is universal, and the absence of de-skilling is a technical deficiency. That's not directly argued for in the article, but it is implied, I would say. I have to come back to it later. So what do I mean to say that the absence of de-skilling is the result of a technical deficiency? Well, it involves looking at the concept of de-skilling, looking at what de-skilling is. And de-skilling is taking away skills from labor, obviously, or degrading the quality and thus the value of labor power. But beyond the Babbage principle and splitting tasks up into smaller ones that are then cheaper, the obvious interest of this by capital is to then transfer those skills to machines and then have machines do them. So the argument I make in this paper is that de-skilling is important, but it is a component of a larger process called absorption. And this comes from Marx, talks like in the Grundrisse, for instance, about how skills and knowledge of labor are absorbed into capital, specifically fixed capital. And this talk of absorption actually pops up all throughout capital if you go looking for it. So I try to think this through and say absorption is the overall process. Skills get transferred into machines under capital's control from labor. So de-skilling is the first stage of this process, the extraction, if you will, of the skills and knowledge, and implementation is the second phase where those are then implemented into some sort of technological substrate. And the argument goes on to say that the nature of that substrate obviously determines whether this is possible and how it's possible and where and with what kinds of work and such, right? So I call the technical infrastructure or the technical substrate in this case the infrastructure of absorption. And this has obviously changed over time. Marx's time, the infrastructure for implementation, captured skill and knowledge was, big machines in the emerging era of large-scale industry, as Marx called it, right? And these were getting increasingly automatic through the use of mechanisms of energy transfer anyways. But since the 1950s, we have information machines, digital computers. And Braverman was writing, in the wake of quite early days of computing, and his brief moments of talking about computers are really, really quite interesting. And I try to dredge those up in this paper and have another look at them. And so the title of the paper is The Universality of the Machine. This is a quote that Braverman uses to talk about the digital computer, which as he rightly notes, and scholars in different fields, including media studies where I work, have noted this, that the interesting thing about the digital computer is that it's the first machine that's functioning is not strictly determined by its physical form, right? It's one architecture, the von Neumann architecture, you can call it, basically, processor, memory, and so on and so forth. All computers are based on this more or less today. Hasn't really changed in basics for 50 plus years. But the whole interesting thing about computers is that they run software and they can implement arbitrarily many different machines on that one machine. And Braverman was presciently aware of this, and that's what he's talking about in terms of the universality of the machine.
2 minutes.
Thank you. And I try to push this kind of thinking forward into the present era. So as you may know, since around 2014 or so, something called machine learning has spread through the world, and Capital is having a field day fantasizing about the future of machine learning and what it's going to do for automation. And automation's back as a thing to talk about. So in short, I think that the advent of machine learning, or machine learning in general, actually leads to a different absorption process than what we've seen mostly throughout history. So the process that Marx and Braverman track, and that Braverman's tracking when he studies Taylorism, is a paradigm of absorption by capture. That's what I call this, based on surveillance. It's the main way. Like, management doesn't know what's going on, wants to automate, you surveil the worker, you capture it. It's old news, right? But it's very effective. But it faces barriers like implicit knowledge, which can't be captured through surveillance. And machine learning can capture that sort of stuff if the relevant data is collected. No one has to know what's going on. The worker doesn't have to be able to articulate it. The management doesn't have to be able to understand what the hell's happening if the relevant data can be collected and a machine learning model can be, pulled out of that data. So I call this absorption by emergence. This is a term that's sometimes used in computing science for how machine learning works. The model emerges from the data. No one has to specify or articulate exactly what's going on, but you can still automate things: translation, facial recognition, so on and so forth. So this obviously presents new means for de-skilling, and it's probably going to get weirder as the machine learning technology sophisticates. So I'll wrap up there. Thank you. And I will pass the mic, as it were, to Stephen Vallas next. Your mic's not on, Stephen.
Yeah, you're on mute.
I know. Okay, very good. Sorry. So let me begin by expressing my gratitude to Bristol University Press, to the outgoing and incoming editors of the journal, and also to Paul Thompson in particular, who encouraged me to keep points. So in my remarks, I want to talk about the broader contribution that our paper makes to the labor process tradition. And I also want to briefly refer to another strand of my research, which involves warehouse workers at Amazon, which also speaks to labor process theory. Both strands of research aim to highlight important gaps or ambiguities in labor process theory and bring into the light these ambiguities and suggest some ways of dealing with them. Now, the paper in the special issue, readers may recall, is yet another study of gig work. What the paper does is it highlights an unresolved problem in the literature on gig work, which we call the paradox of gig worker consent. So for roughly 10 years now, we've had studies that have engaged in a kind of a narrative of subjugation. Workers are subjected to algorithmic controls over their labor, and yet nonetheless seem to respond with consent to their work situations. This is the paradox of consent. Why should workers so tightly and despotically controlled find affirmation in their work? Now, let me just say that, of course, there is episodic resistance, but in the US at least, consent predominates. You see this in survey research, you see it in the nature of some of the resistance movements. So the question then is, well, how do we reconcile the despotic appearance of the regimes with the emergence of consent? So some efforts have appealed to neoliberal framing of gig work, gamification, and some other efforts at explanation. But Julie Shore and I are convinced that these efforts really fail to explain why such entrepreneurial ideologies resonate so effectively. And what we try to do in this paper is to transcend certain limiting assumptions about gig work. Mainly the assumption which pervades the literature, really, the assumption that all gig workers belong to the working class. Right? This is just a common assumption, a point of departure. Now, our sense is that this assumption, which we've called the fallacy of uniformity, is especially inappropriate for gig work because in many labor platforms, there's an open relationship of employment wherein there are very few barriers to entry, which escalates the heterogeneity of the workforce and calls for more attention to the class dispersed nature of the labor on which gig platforms rely. So this introduces divisions among the gig workforce that need much further discussion, we argue. And we basically develop an analysis on the basis of 70 interviews with gig workers who are employed in ride-hail and as couriers and other services in place. That holds that workers with a foothold in the middle class approach gig work as providing a mechanism of class reproduction for them. Now, what we mean is that workers who would previously have enjoyed internal labor markets, wage gains, and other benefits are drawn toward gig work, accessing job rewards that enable them to maintain their middle-class identities, using their earnings for vacations, presents for children, gambling, and other forms of discretionary spending. The idea is that blocked in terms of the Fordist employment relationship, which is no longer so rewarding, workers voluntarily engage in gig work as a way of maintaining positions that require additional labor, although they don't perceive the exploitation that's implied there. So what we're basically arguing is that workers, in order to maintain their middle-class identities, engage in a kind of a source of access. They pursue access for earnings that enable them to maintain levels of consumption and forms of consumption that anchor them in the middle class. For them, gig work becomes a labor of affirmation, a way of compensating for the job rewards they would otherwise have lost. Now, we also find that there are many gig workers who hold much more precarious positions in the economy. And here again, class reproduction happens in that the labor platforms essentially only ever perpetuate their disadvantaged position in the class structure, which does generate resistance and resentment among their ranks. The result, however, is that is to encourage them to experience gig work as a labor not of affirmation but of denigration. So our point is that responses to gig work are only explicable when we become attentive to the class-based influences that workers bring with them into the labor process, and particularly the importance of consumption as a part of the identities that workers seek to maintain. Now, let me expand on this point just a bit. One of the attractions of labor process theory for people such as myself, and I suspect for many others on this call, is that it allows us to peer into the innermost domain of class domination. In this view, the immediate process of production and the relations of production that govern it are a fundamental source of class inequality. Hence our interest in it. Now, the problem, 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
The problem is that the bearing of the class concept has remained unarticulated in labor process theory in the decades since Braverman wrote, allowing us to assume that the capital accumulation process, the introduction of new technologies, and new managerial strategies all impact workers in much the same way. Now, this is the point that I suggest that we rethink. Both the labor process itself, together with influences rooted in the labor market, in the broader culture and the broader political economy, constitute workers in complex and often contradictory ways, resulting in far-reaching divisions, not homogeneity among the workers involved. Now, we do well to recall that Braverman was not shy about using the class concept, but he did so in a way that spoke of the degradation of labor, the homogenization of the working class. These are themes that that Julie and I and some of my other colleagues have found especially problematic, and in some cases find more value in researchers such as Richard Edwards and Andrew Friedman have used more complex notions of managerial regimes. Edwards, in particular, identified what might be called the gradation of labor, not the degradation of labor, and Andrew Friedman, with his well-known conception of direct control versus responsible autonomy, a dual conception of labor control. These are some of the points that we try and pursue in our paper. Some of them are more implied than others. I only have perhaps 45 seconds to suggest that some of my colleagues and I have also been studying and finding similar processes among warehouse workers employed by Amazon. Amazon is known for its abusive and coercive labor controls, and we found much evidence that in fact, digital surveillance serves to establish what we call techno-economic despotism. But this is not the only form of labor control that Amazon uses. There are other much more affirmative forms of labor control. Casting a shadow over much of the workforce that Amazon does employ is precarity. We found in a quantitative paper that Amazon workers who are facing especially precarious conditions are especially likely to be tolerant of the most abusive conditions that Amazon imposes on them. Not so much for workers who have somewhat more advantaged positions than the labor market. So we're arguing on behalf of bringing in to the analysis the concept of class, position in the labor market, and relation to the means of consumption, and in this way, complicating but strengthening the labor process tradition. Thank you all.
Thank you, Stephen. That's fascinating. I mean, all the contributions are really thought-provoking, and I'm going to kick us off with a question which is my own question. I hope you'll pardon me there. But thinking about all these issues that you've talked about class, about consent, which is difficult to explain in such conditions. Fear appears to work, and it always has. But I'm just wondering, as a panel, what you feel. I mean, everybody's talked in some way or other about legitimation, about labor power, about consent. And I'm just wondering whether in a new technological age, employers are that worried about consent at all anymore. I mean, they have spent an awful lot of time trying to make us feel like we're part of something. They do try to legitimate themselves and their power. It's always intrigued me as someone who studies working conditions in the clothing industry, for example, why brands seem to be so concerned about their reputation, because they're very successful and it doesn't seem to affect them if they get a bad reputation. So the question that I was wondering if you could speak to in the broadest of terms is, in our current technological state, in our current context, does consent matter anymore? And you know, if it does, how does it, and why does it? So perhaps you'd like to start us off there, Stephen, or if anybody else wants to come in. Oh, you're on.
I think that many of the fundamental concepts of labor process theory really do need to be brought together into bolder relief. So we use many concepts. We use hegemony, we use coercion, we use consent, and we throw these terms around in ways that sometimes lead us to fixate on one or another end of continua. So my sense, and I don't want to go on at great length here, is that consent is partly important for the reasons that Sarah and her co-author are bringing out, and in that workers do need to elicit the commitment of workers to the performance of the tasks. And even in a Weberian way, a purely despotic regime whether in the workplace or in the polity more generally, is often a quite brittle phenomenon, right? So that's one point. But I do think that coercion and consent are not the only opportunities here that capital can use. Another term that we somehow never use is the term compliance, right? Which is less thrilling, less filled with enthusiasm, but nonetheless it's more behavioral. So I think that is a kind of perhaps a concept that might serve us well. But so let me stop there.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to come in there? James or Sarah?
I can try, because Stephen was just talking about my contribution. Well, I would just say basically the same thing in other words. I think there might be 2 points to this. First of all, I don't think coercion and consent should be thought of as a as an alternative. I think they're always entangled with each other. There's an interrelationship, and I think if we think about automation and technical automation as something that solves all managerial problems, maybe then we could think about, labor doesn't have to add anything anymore. But I think they're like inherent contradictories to the capitalist production process that even the best technology is not able to solve. And management makes use of the indeterminacy of human labor. And I think that only works if there's at least part of trying to get the subject going somehow. And also I'd like to point out that consent, again, similar as what Stephen was saying, is not necessarily like with an emphasis. It's not necessarily like normative control, being convinced about something. But as I tried to point out with inner marketization, it's rather, in our case, it's rather a sense of, there's no alternative. So it's sort of a compliance as well.
Can I jump in?
Say something? Oh, sorry, go on.
I just want to piggyback on this discussion about consent and legitimation from if we talk this from Gramsci's perspective, this ideological dimension for maintaining the social political order, I think it's even more relevant in the context of a technological revolution, or what you want to call it, a dystopia, because if you think about the this is not just the issue of the capital, the enterprise and company level and workers, also at societal level, from the governing, from the state, the ruling class. We think about the China case. Often there's assumption that the Chinese state can do whatever because it's like very strong, powerful, and authoritarian. But even like in that context, the Chinese government is highly cautious and sensitive to the public viewpoint on the technological future. Just taking an example, the recent driverless taxi, the launch, the kind of experiment, the driverless taxi in Wuhan, and it caused a huge, Chinese public discussion and backlash. The idea that this is going to be really cause livelihood of many, the on-demand drivers and taxi drivers, and what is it's basically very pessimistic about this using machine to replace human labor, right? So that directly affect the Chinese government discourse, and taking a very, very more take it back in terms of the push towards driverless cars, the AI, So I do think this discussion is even more relevant today about consent, legitimation, and what kind of society we want, right? In the sense that it's not just at the company level, at the enterprise level, but as a whole societal level. So I just want to make this comment.
Thank you, Zhang. Paul and then James.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, consent clearly matters to some workplace regimes more than others. There are workplaces at the bottom end of the scale where I would argue consent, at least in the way that Burrowoy referred to consent as a kind of active process, doesn't really matter very much, particularly where you've got sources of labor supply in which workers can interchangeable but of low skill, and where sources of labor supply, they can live with high levels of labor turnover and so on. And that's an important point, but I am quite resistant to overgeneralization about the extent, whole epochs which can be defined by a term that refers to consent. It's clearly absurd. And we have to be really careful, but we also have to, as Stephen suggests, expand our conceptual vocabulary so that things that were actually important in previous debates, Paul Edwards's work, for example, put a lot more emphasis on not just compliance, but accommodation between capital and labor. And, the richer we can make the conceptual vocabulary and the better we can locate its different configurations with respect to distinctive workplace regimes across different sectors and institutional contexts, the better off we'll be.
James, just the last point on this question.
On a related point to Paul's, I guess, I think consent is typically associated with more elite sectors of labor. This would be a rough heuristic that I would make. I study the elite sector, the strata of the tech sector, and their consent obviously is really important, right? Data scientists and coders in Silicon Valley get all sorts of these perks, which are meant to buy their consent. And when you talk to them, even when they are somewhat critical or even quite critical, and they know what's the problems with the industry they work in, they give their consent, in part because of their massive salaries, but also because of the stock options and all the other perks that one obtains in those sort of jobs. So yeah, at least in the area I study, consent is alive and well. And
well, we've got one question which is has been posted for Stephen, but I think maybe everybody can chime in the last 6 minutes that we have of the webinar. So we've got to be quick because it's a big question. How does distinguishing between more precarious and less precarious workers within the working class contribute to revolutionary or practical goals? What is the strategic or theoretical value of creating such divisions? How might this influence the strategies, structures, and collective behavior of workers' organizations, and how could it shape solidarity or fragmentation within labor movements? Essentially, what implications does it have for advancing broader working class struggles? Now, that's a big question, and we have 6 minutes. But I'll come to Stephen first, because it was a question posed for you, and then we'll see how much else we can say.
Let me be economical with respect to gig work. My sense is that organizing efforts to mobilize workers to protect their means of livelihood need to be much more attentive to the reasons why many workers actually reject the answers or the solutions that are being proposed for them. Many workers who are middle-class identifiers, for example, they feel that becoming employees would undermine the very purpose of what they're trying to accomplish. So which is to escape the clutches that they experience in their day jobs, so to speak. So one point I want to make is that, first of all, it's not the analyst who's creating the divisions, but rather recognizing them as kind of a part of the being of the manifold body of the working class. So becoming more attentive to the differences and the orientations that workers bring to bear on their labor, this is just fundamental task. Any labor organizer will know that. So this is one of the purposes, I believe. But it's also what we found in our research on Amazon is that precarity affects workers' orientations in very powerful ways. And in fact, what we found is that, to loop back to the idea of consent, is that many workers show their a devotion to Amazon precisely because it provides a sanctuary from the precarity that they've seen all around them. And they actually come to believe that organizing on their own behalf would actually only compound the risks that are so uppermost in their mind. So the point is to try and become more sensitive to the outlooks that workers are bringing to bear upon their own labor, so that we can more effectively speak to them and challenge the domination that is often naturalized from their perspective. Thank you.
Yeah. Would anybody else like to come in there? I mean, I think if I can just comment there, I think, yeah, I think it's essential that we look at what workers are saying and what they're how they behave, and not just think, well, they're not behaving rationally. They're very often are behaving perfectly rationally, but understanding that is, it's the first step to organizing, isn't it? Well, we're 3 minutes away from the end of this webinar, and I want to congratulate all of you for making. Oh, Sarah, did you want to say something?
No, not necessarily.
Go on.
Now, basically, I haven't finished my thoughts, so maybe it's not a good idea to keep on talking. So basically, the first thing I wanted to say was, again, repeating Stephen to say, I guess, acknowledging the differences in interests is the first step to find a common ground in interests again.
Yeah.
That was the one thing. And the other thing I was just thinking about was how mobilization not necessarily just rests on your own expectations. I miss a better word in English at the moment, but your own demands are being violated, but also, well, a sense of the violation of your ideas of justice being violated if you yourself are affected or not. So I haven't come to a conclusion at the moment. I'm just wanted to say it's not necessarily just being yourself affected by it, but also watching others being affected can be a source of mobilization.
Could
Yeah,
I just say
absolutely.
something very briefly?
Yes, Paul.
Yeah, the reason I didn't respond quickly is that by the time it got to the end of the question, I'd forgotten what the start of the question was. But remembering what I could from it, I think Stephen made the point before about Braverman, given that we are still talking about Braverman in this webinar, had these orthodox Marxist assumptions about changes in the labor process leading to homogenization, and he talked about the eventual emergence of the proletarian form, which would lead to revolutionary conscience and so on. I mean, it really was rubbish, basically. I mean, it hasn't turned out that way, and it was very unlikely to turn out that way, given how the labor process and divisions in the labor process and variations in the labor process and the labor markets which feed into the labor process are formed. But as two of my co-authors have said, you have to start from the gradations in order to understand the points at which you can generate solidarity. And I would like to suggest that the term in Braverman that we should resuscitate is not so much de-skilling, but degradation. Degradation of work emerges in a whole variety of forms and can be experienced by the kind of workers that James you know, studies as well as the warehouse workers. And I think there is a politics of production that can bring together the various experiences of the way that the capitalist organization of work degrades labor, that does offer some possibilities.
Yeah, that's a nice one, Paul. I just want to say I agree with that. And Cory Doctorow has the term, coined the term recently, "enshittification," to talk about the effects of increasingly pointless integrations of technology into everyone's work and life. So maybe that's another way of connecting to degradation.
And on that note, Zhang, you didn't want to say anything there, did you? I don't want to cut you off before we finish.
Oh no, yeah, I found this is a very productive conversation. Yeah.
So I'd just like to thank everybody. You were absolutely perfectly timed. You can read all these papers in I think for free, if I'm right. That I think that's just come up in the chat, but until the end of the month, yes. So thank you everybody for attending. We hope you found this stimulating, and that you'll go on to read the papers and contribute to the journal in the future. Thank you ever so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean.